Modern imagination often places the Tudor era inside a giant, invisible cloud of thick mud, sweat, and plague. We picture a world of permanently filthy peasants stumbling through fog, while cartoonish tyrants shout from drafty castles. That same dramatic lens follows us into antiquity. Cleopatra is frequently framed as a love-struck queen of leisure, spending her days draped in luxury and exotic fruits, while focusing entirely on romantic intrigue. By the time we reach the 19th century American West, the Lewis and Clark expedition is often presented as a glorious, unblemished stroll through unmapped territory, a grand adventure destined for the history books. These cinematic archetypes create a clean, digestible version of the past. They present a world where those who came before us were either hopelessly romantic, incredibly ignorant, or technologically primitive. The actual records suggest a world of cold calculation. Survival in these eras depended on high-stakes strategy and a ruthless, practical understanding of power. Tudor hygiene, for instance, involved far more than simply ignoring the smell. Wealthy households relied on clean linen undergarments to absorb sweat and dirt, while importing scented soaps and herbal rinses from Europe to maintain a status-driven standard of cleanliness. Their intellectual world was equally sharp. Educated Tudors possessed an advanced understanding of global navigation and mathematics. The myth that sailors lived in fear of a flat Earth was a later invention. 16th century explorers used sophisticated astronomy to cross oceans. This portrait of Henry VIII shows how they weaponized information. The king is shown in an artificially widened stance, his frame bulked up by massive layers of luxury fabric to project a specific image of physical and political dominance to his subjects and rivals. Queen Elizabeth I took this visual propaganda even further. Portraits like this one emphasized her unnatural, flawless pale skin and pearls representing purity, creating a symbolic, immortal figure that protected her absolute political control as an unmarried woman. The art and public romance of the period served as tactical levers. They projected a facade of stability, while the royal court itself operated as a lethally unstable psychological battlefield. That same level of calculation defined the ancient world. A Mediterranean banquet might appear to be a moment of pure, unmeasured leisure, filled with exotic wine and music. But the famous feasts shared by Cleopatra and Mark Antony served a specific purpose. The Egyptian queen transformed these romantic settings into sophisticated intelligence-gathering operations. Cleopatra used overwhelming luxury and theatrical spectacle to disarm Roman guests. While the officers drank, she extracted military secrets and mapped out the political vulnerabilities of Rome's leadership. The Persian Empire employed a similar strategy through architecture. At Persepolis, events like the royal wedding used the towering scale of these columns to physically overwhelm foreign delegations, making them feel small beneath the weight of imperial power. Ancient rulers utilized extravagant hospitality to assert dominance. They managed dangerous political alliances under the guise of celebration, turning the dinner table into a primary field of battle. In the 19th century American West, the Lewis and Clark expedition confronted an immense physical scale. This was an unforgiving landscape that offered no margin for error or romantic adventure. This diagram of their 55-foot keelboat illustrates the logistical weight of that reality. The hull was packed with thousands of pounds of gunpowder, salt pork, medical supplies, and trade goods, the exact inventory required to survive in isolation. The sudden illness and death of Sergeant Charles Floyd acted as a grim turning point. It stripped away any illusions of an invincible journey, proving that a single infection could end a life hundreds of miles from help. Their encounters with native nations were similarly grounded in pragmatism. These were tense, high-stakes diplomatic negotiations where avoiding military conflict was the only way for the small expedition to stay alive. The core of Discovery succeeded through desperate practical maneuvering. They survived an environment indifferent to their goals by making hard, calculated decisions at every turn. Elizabeth I, Cleopatra, and the Lewis and Clark expedition were united by a fundamental, ruthless pragmatism. Survival in their respective worlds demanded it. We simplify their stories into archetypes because the messy, exhausting truth of human struggle is less comforting than a dramatic myth. It allows modern society to view the past from a safe, superior distance. But removing these Hollywood filters makes history more compelling. It reveals that the people of the past were just as strategic, frightened, and intelligent as we are today. They navigated incredibly high stakes with remarkable clarity. Beneath the embroidered layers and the legends, they weren't characters in a movie. They were people trying to survive the reality of their time.
Imagine life long before cities or locked doors. Prehistoric humans lived entirely exposed in deep forests, surrounded by predators and a wilderness that offered no mercy. Every twig snap in the dark signaled the potential for a violent end. No species can invent agriculture or build monuments while paralyzed by constant panic. To simply survive the winter, early humans had to find a way to quiet the deafening alarm bells ringing in their own heads. Alongside physical tools like fire and spears, early humans engineered powerful psychological and social shields to defend their own minds. These mental barriers allowed them to face the darkness with calculated confidence. This architecture of comfort took many forms. Forms of accidental intoxication, belief in magical amulets, and extreme tribal discipline. Each one acted as a critical mechanism designed to turn prehistoric chaos into a navigable sense of order. Millions of years ago, early primates evolved to track the smell of ethanol. That sweet scent led them to ripe, calorie-rich fruit rotting under the sun. In a world of starvation, following that smell meant finding the energy needed to live. Eventually, accidental fermentation transitioned into intentional brewing. This created a social glue that provided temporary relief from prehistoric threats. For a few hours around a campfire, the lethal wilderness waiting just outside the firelight seemed to fade away. Grain farming allowed humans to produce these drinks consistently. Some archaeological evidence suggests early farming communities prioritized grain specifically to guarantee a steady supply of beer, choosing to settle down to keep the fermentation process running. In early cities, clean water was a rarity. The brewing process killed off harmful bacteria, making beer a foundational public health tool. Ancient humans discovered that consuming fermented grain was often the only way to stay hydrated without risking a diseased water supply. This clay tablet shows exactly how that demand was managed. Officials used these individual cells to record complex transactions and track the distribution of beer, which functioned as a primary currency for paying laborers. The Egyptians scaled this system to support their monuments. These carved figures show the physical labor of kneading and processing grain, a constant activity in Egyptian households. The workers building the pyramids were sustained by massive daily rations of this intoxicating grain sludge. Alcohol functioned as a critical biological and communal pressure valve. It transformed the crushing stress of early urban life into something survivable, turning a biological calorie tracker into civilization's primary social glue. Ancient Egyptians faced a uniquely volatile environment. Random disease, predators, and unpredictable Nile floods created a world where disaster could arrive without warning. To counter this, they centered their culture on Ma'at, the sacred balance of truth and order. Daily rituals were the weapons used to fight back against the invisible, chaotic forces believed to be lurking around every corner. Physical amulets served as wearable armor against chaos. This blue amulet of the god Bez displays dwarf-like distorted features, designed for a specific psychological purpose. By giving Bez a lion-like mane and glaring eyes, they created an intimidating figure. They believed this terrifying appearance frightened away evil spirits, making it a favorite protective charm. Other symbols offered a sense of control over physical injury. This wedget eye, with its carved pupil and rigid lines, represented healing and wholeness. Carrying it provided a mental defense against the fear of sickness or accident. The ultimate dread, however, was the afterlife judgment.
This papyrus depicts the jackal-headed god weighing a human heart against the feather of truth. If the heart was heavy with sin, the soul faced total deletion. To prevent their own hearts from betraying them, Egyptians utilized heart scarabs like this one. These amulets, with their wide, outstretched wings, were inscribed with spells intended to keep the heart silent during its final judgment. By wrapping mummies in magical charms, the Egyptians built a highly sophisticated mental framework for establishing order.
These rituals offered a tangible sense of control over a volatile, unpredictable reality. In the jagged mountains of ancient Illyria, the terrain itself demanded absolute tribal loyalty. These rocky slopes in freezing winters offered no protection to anyone standing alone. Survival required an unbreakable group bond. This intense tribal brotherhood was the only defense against organized foreign powers. While these dense, identical rows of Roman soldiers represent a massive military machine, the Illyrians used their knowledge of the mountains and blood oaths to resist for generations. We see this same reliance on a brotherhood shield in a very different environment, the medieval monastery. Here, the enemy wasn't a foreign army, but the moral chaos of the outside world. Monks used physical discomfort, silence, and sleep deprivation to strip away worldly distractions. By sharing these hardships, they replaced individual identity with an unbreakable communal spirit.
The tonsure was the visual mark of this commitment. This circular shaved crown acted as a form of visual branding, signaling a complete rejection of personal vanity and absolute loyalty to the monastic community. Whether navigating brutal mountain passes or freezing scriptoriums, surviving a harsh existence required the same sacrifice, abandoning the individual self to forge a disciplined collective shield. Worshipping beer goddesses, wearing demon amulets, or taking blood oaths in the mountains may seem bizarre to us today, but these weren't random habits. They were engineering. Each of these mechanisms formed a layer of a psychological shield. Intoxication, superstition, and brotherhood were designed to block out the terror of existence and make life navigable. These shields often interlocked. Medieval monks were master brewers, and tribal warriors carried sacred amulets into battle. Together, these layers created a single, unbreakable shield that protected the human psyche from a hostile universe. Even in our safer modern world, this wiring remains. Our reliance on group identity, social drinking, and shared rituals shows that we still seek the same forms of insulation our ancestors invented. Survival depended on our unique ability to engineer shared rituals and tight-knit communities. These collective frameworks allowed us to insulate our minds against a hostile universe, creating a psychological refuge that matched any physical fortress. Every day, thousands of visitors flock to historic streets like this one to snap pictures of the charming, leaning timber buildings. It looks like a pristine fairy tale, perfectly preserved for a postcard. But that quaint charm hides a spectacularly grim reality. A few centuries ago, this specific location was a hyper-congested, deafening alleyway dominated by butchers, lined with animal carcasses and buried in rotting waste. Even those famous leaning upper floors aren't some quirky architectural choice. Land inside the city walls was incredibly expensive, and property taxes were calculated based on the ground floor footprint. To maximize living space without paying higher taxes, residents simply built their upper stories projecting outward over the street below. Look closer at the road itself. It was engineered with a deliberate V shape, dipping down to a central gutter. That gutter had a specific purpose: channeling rivers of animal blood, waste, and organs away from shops whenever it rained. By consuming history as a sanitized theme park, we erase the physical weight of these environments. Our ancestors did not live in a fantasy novel. They navigated relentless, unsanitary conditions to build the foundations of the modern world. There was no separation between slaughterhouse and showroom. Animals were butchered openly. Their skinned carcasses hung directly outside. Discarded organs, bones, and raw fat piled up, while gallons of blood poured directly onto the uneven ground, creating a sprawling breeding ground for flies. This exact combination of dense overcrowding, limited airflow, and raw animal waste functioned as a highly efficient incubator for pathogens. When the Black Death reached these streets, the unsanitary environment offered zero protection, allowing the disease to wipe out entire households in a matter of days. If disease didn't empty the neighborhood, a single overturned candle could. The entire urban grid consisted of cheap timber frames packed shoulder to shoulder, heated by open flames. They accidentally created a massive wooden tinderbox, where one unattended hearth could ruin an entire community in an afternoon. The physical hazards were matched only by the cultural volatility. In 1190, extreme economic frustration and religious prejudice boiled over into a violent mob. Hundreds of York's Jewish citizens, who filled vital economic roles, sought safety inside Clifford's Tower, only to face a devastating massacre when the siege collapsed. The people operating in these streets were fiercely resilient economic drivers. They forged a booming multi-generational trade out of a relentless survival gauntlet, navigating extreme physical and social dangers every single day.
Now, move away from the urban squalor and into the ancient wilderness, where we often imagine joyous, simple community gatherings around a roaring fire. The reality is that Celtic feasts were tense, high-stakes geopolitical summits. Feeding thousands of attendees required weeks of preparation and terrifying logistical risks. It meant organizing hunting parties to take down wild boar and sacrificing huge herds of domesticated cattle, livestock that physically represented a chieftain's total wealth and political power. The cauldron functioned as the central engine of tribal abundance, status, and spiritual power. Capable of feeding hundreds of people at once, these massive bronze or silver vessels were the focal point of the gathering. The distribution of that meat rigidly enforced the social hierarchy, awarding the choicest cuts, known as the champion's portion, to the most respected guest, frequently triggered fierce arguments, violent wrestling matches, and full-scale armed brawls over perceived insults.
To keep things functioning, alcohol flowed continuously. Massive consumption of mead and highly prized imported wine forced rival factions to remain in close proximity. As the drinks poured, defensive postures softened enough to negotiate vital trade deals, arrange strategic marriages, and cement fragile alliances. These cauldrons and endless drinking horns were entirely calculated. They were a necessary survival mechanism, engineered to unify deeply divided, isolated tribes and prevent constant territorial warfare. Ascending to the absolute top of the social ladder reveals that elite indulgence was often a dangerous, self-destructive form of statecraft. We idolize stoic, heroic monarchs, but the reality often involved state-sponsored competitive drinking contests that paralyzed governments. Alexander the Great weaponized extreme Macedonian drinking culture to maintain bonds with his generals. This strategy of competitive intoxication had legal consequences, climaxing when an enraged, intoxicated Alexander grabbed a spear and murdered his trusted friend during a banquet. The Roman Emperor Tiberius escalated this toxic behavior to an administrative level. He actively rewarded officials based on their physical endurance at the feast table, famously promoting a nobleman named Lucius Piso to his inner circle, primarily because Piso could consume extreme quantities of wine without collapsing. Centuries later, Peter the Great mandated participation in his all-joking, all-drunken synod. He used grueling, multi-day drinking marathons to test the physical limits and loyalty of foreign diplomats, forcing them into massive overconsumption before they could negotiate trade agreements or military alliances. By the 19th century, King George IV took indulgence to such an extreme that his own waistline became a national punchline. His endless consumption of food and wine destroyed his health, handing critics a perfect symbol of unchecked royal greed while his subjects struggled. Unrestrained monarchical indulgence was a profound geopolitical liability.
When the people with absolute power spent their days testing the limits of their own livers, it compromised vital decision-making and destabilized the reputations of the dynasties they represented. So how did we forget all of this? During the 19th and 20th centuries, modernization rapidly scrubbed the streets clean. Centralized slaughterhouses moved the gore and the flies out of the public eye, while modern civic governance slowly replaced the unpredictable whims of absolute monarchs. At the same time, Victorian preservationists looked at dilapidated, highly dangerous medieval slums and saw historical value. Instead of tearing down the old timber frames, they repaired and protected them, deliberately transforming outdated commercial traps into pristine historic treasures. Time has a remarkable ability to act as a filter. It naturally erases the suffocating smells, the rampant disease, and the day-to-day suffering, leaving behind nothing but the beautiful, silent architecture. Today, we browse polished souvenir shops and drink coffee under those same crooked beams, standing directly atop a centuries-old legacy of blood, grit, and desperate survival. History lives in the endurance of the ordinary people who survived this messy reality, hidden in plain sight beneath the modern veneer. The buildings remain, but the true story is the 1,000 years of struggle it took to keep them standing.
When we picture the ancient world, we usually imagine something completely silent: pristine white marble statues, noble philosophers, and stoics staring off into the distance. But the reality was loud, muddy, aggressively colorful, and completely chaotic. Our ancestors spent little time making historic speeches to the Senate or marching into glorious battle. Most of their lives were occupied by a much more relatable problem: figuring out what to do with a random Tuesday afternoon. To understand how they actually lived, we have to look at a progression of human needs. It starts with the freezing fight against nature, moves into the drive for social status, and culminates in a relentless battle against extreme boredom. Civilization evolves through these shifting priorities, as the struggle for a warm bed gives way to the hunt for social status, and eventually the search for a distraction. At the base of this pyramid, the environment dictates every human behavior. On the freezing edges of the North Sea, Viking daily life was a masterclass in practical engineering, far removed from the theatrical horned helmet myths. Survival meant mastering wool and leather. They stitched their shoes inside out and then reversed them, a technique designed to hide seams and prevent damp ground from rotting the thread. Every layer was a barrier against a landscape that seemed engineered to punish human optimism. Further south, the Illyrian tribes of the ancient Balkans faced a different seasonal hostage situation. A brutal mountain winter meant months of total isolation, crowded beside a central hearth while food stores shrank and snow blocked the mountain paths. The moment the snow melted, they lit enormous bonfires across the hillsides. These spring festivals were vital rituals of relief, loud communal celebrations of the tribe's sheer endurance. At this level of the hierarchy, everything from the way a boot was sewn to the rhythm of a village dance was dictated by the requirement to outlast the environment. Once basic warmth is secured, the next priority is social positioning. This transition is visible in the suspiciously clean Viking, who used hygiene as a tool for status. Viking archaeological sites are packed with bone combs, tweezers, and ear cleaners. They washed regularly, groomed their hair with precision, and maintained a level of personal hygiene that often shocked the medieval maiders they encountered during their travels. Wealth was worn openly. Massive hoards of hacked silver and intricate arm rings turned a warrior's body into a portable bank account. It was an aggressive, visual display of political power and trade connections. These connections reached as far as the Silk Road, which operated as the ancient world's first global fashion network. Color and fabric became the primary language of authority, with shimmering silks and rare dyes signaling status across thousands of miles. Even traditional court fashion had to adapt to reality. Practical nomadic stepriders introduced fitted trousers to the world. eventually forcing aristocratic empires to trade their flowing, theatrical robes for something that actually functioned on a horse. These garments were a complex visual shorthand, communicating alliances and wealth across vast, hostile distances before a single word was spoken. When an empire achieves total dominance, it generates a unique crisis, a dangerous amount of wealth combined with a terrifying lack of things to do. By the time of the Caesars, Rome was a civilization locked in a fight against its own restlessness. Ordinary Romans self-medicated against boredom through relentless gambling. In smoky taverns across the city, men rolled these bone dice for hours, losing horses, property, and family vineyards to a single bad throw. Those who weren't at the tavern were at the public baths. These were high-volume social arenas where thousands gathered to network, trade rumors, and participate in the sensory overload of Roman public life. For the elites, the distractions became increasingly absurd. Aristocrats imported peacocks from distant continents purely for decoration and developed bizarre emotional attachments to expensive exotic fish, sometimes holding full funerals for a pet eel. In the streets, citizens engaged in a petty public troll culture. The walls of Pompeii are covered in scratched graffiti, where strangers argued over wine, mocked politicians, and shared deeply unnecessary personal information. Eventually, these small diversions weren't enough. Rome responded by industrializing spectacle. They built the Circus Maximus and the Colosseum to host chariot races and gladiatorial combat on a scale that could overwhelm the senses of an entire population. From the dice board to the arena floor, Roman society effectively weaponized the afternoon. They constructed a permanent, high-volume distraction to keep a massive, restless population from turning its energy against itself. Our ancestors were ordinary, flawed people, driven by the same relatable desires we navigate every day. You can trace a direct line from a Viking fixing his winter boots, to a Silk Road merchant judging a rival's outfit, to a Roman leaving a petty comment on a public wall. The next time you feel guilty for wasting an evening on trivial entertainment, remember that you are participating in humanity's most enduring tradition, simply finding a way to pass the afternoon.
We tend to view absolute rulers as forces of nature, men like Alexander the Great who shape the ancient world through sheer will and battlefield genius, demanding to be remembered as living gods. But absolute political power relies entirely on a fragile human body, and bodies fail. For over a decade, Alexander survived arrows, swords, and close-quarters combat. Yet in the summer of 323 BC, inside the grand palaces of Babylon, a microscopic organism, likely a waterborne bacteria causing typhoid fever, put him in bed. A week later, he was dead. At 32, he had amassed a unified territory stretching across 3 continents, from Greece to India. He died without leaving a clear successor to manage it. Because one biological organism failed, his generals immediately turned on each other, plunging the ancient world into decades of civil war. You see the exact same biological trap centuries later with King Henry VIII. In his youth, he looked every bit the invincible Renaissance king, athletic, imposing, and enormously popular. Then came the jousting accidents, years of severe physical trauma, culminating in a catastrophic fall in 1536, left him with painful, ulcerated legs and limited mobility. As his physical health deteriorated, his political temperament became erratic and lethal. Added to this chronic pain was a terrifying biological reality. He lacked a healthy male heir. To secure one, Henry dismantled centuries of established Catholic authority in England, replacing an entire religious infrastructure to solve his personal marital crisis. When ultimate authority is tied to a single decaying human body, the epicenter of an empire becomes a ticking time bomb. The real question is how everyone else survives standing in the blast radius. Proximity to the crown required constant psychological calculation. The Tudor court functioned as a lethal ecosystem, where a single misread of the king's mood could end your life. His wives developed entirely different survival strategies.
Catherine of Aragon stubbornly relied on legal tradition and the Pope's authority. She refused to yield, and for her rigid dignity, she was cast aside. Anne Boleyn played an aggressive, highly influential political game, but when her biology failed to provide Henry with a surviving son, her political capital evaporated, leading her straight to the executioner's block at the Tower of London. Then there is Anne of Cleves. When Henry decided he wanted out of their marriage, she looked at the grim track record of her predecessors and cooperated completely. By surrendering without a fight, she secured vast estates, a massive income, and the rare privilege of keeping her head attached to her shoulders. Finally, Catherine Parr managed the aging, pain-ridden tyrant by mastering submissive agreement. When conservative courtiers nearly had her arrested over a theological debate, she immediately pivoted, claiming she only argued to learn from his superior wisdom. At the highest levels of power, physical strength meant very little. True survival required an acute ability to read, interpret, and manipulate the psychological and biological vulnerabilities of the ruler. That same dynamic trickled down to the lowest rungs of the social ladder. Consider the medieval food taster, a job defined entirely by a ruler's terror of a sudden death. Popular depictions usually show tasters shielding kings from exotic assassins, but their real value was in managing the king's everyday internal paranoia. A medieval banquet was a claustrophobic gathering of ambitious, well-armed rivals. Because medical science was essentially non-existent, any sudden fever or spoiled stomach from bad meat was instantly blamed on a conspiracy. The taster's performance was theatrical. By consuming a piece of roasted venison before a silent room, the servant provided a public display of safety that allowed the court to function for another evening. Whether you wore a crown, shared the royal bed, or carried a silver platter, extreme proximity to power meant your daily existence was dictated by the personal anxieties of the person in charge. The vast majority of human history, however, occurs far from the claustrophobia of the throne room. Out in the rural farmlands, the Germanic midsummer festivals offered a complete contrast to court life. These decentralized gatherings weren't about managing the paranoia of a king. They were anchored to the predictable cycles of nature. While the nobility sat through tense, suspicious banquets, thousands of commoners gathered on the longest day of the year. They lit massive bonfires, shared seasonal harvests, arranged their marriages, and danced late into the night. This image displays the intricate gold craftsmanship these communities produced. These artifacts point to a sophisticated society that thrived entirely independently of any centralized royal authority. It creates a fascinating irony. Henry VIII desperately wanted history to remember him as a mighty conqueror and a founder of an unbreakable dynasty. Instead, millions of people today primarily remember him through a catchy nursery rhyme about the 6 women he married. Alexander the Great demanded to be worshipped as a living god, yet the moment his physical body gave out, his life's work dissolved into chaos. Empires rise and fall based on a single body's failures, but history is built on the calculated survival of the anonymous masses and the traditions that outlast their kings. Human skin color is our most visible difference, a trait that has served as a primary foundation for social hierarchies and political divisions across centuries. Yet, underneath the weight of that history, this variation is nothing more than a simple evolutionary sunscreen setting. To see why it exists, we have to travel back 200,000 years to the birthplace of modern humans. In the landscapes of ancient Africa, shade was often a luxury, and the sun poured down intense ultraviolet radiation with relentless consistency. While UV radiation is useful in small amounts, excessive exposure destroys folate, a vitamin critical for healthy reproduction and fetal development. For early humans, losing too much folate meant losing the ability to produce healthy children. Evolution responded with melanin, a shield that absorbs harmful radiation before it reaches the body's folate reserves. Darker skin was vital. But as humans migrated north into Europe and Asia, they encountered weaker sunlight, creating a new biological dilemma. Humans need a certain amount of UV radiation to penetrate the skin to produce vitamin D, which is essential for healthy bones and immune function. In northern latitudes, dark skin was too effective. It blocked the very radiation needed for survival. Natural selection began favoring individuals with less melanin, allowing more light to penetrate and produce the vitamin D required for life. From a biological perspective, skin color was never a blueprint for identity or status. It is a geographical balancing act between the need to protect folate and the need to produce vitamin D. Because human populations were constantly moving and mixing, skin color developed as a cline, a continuous, fluid geographic spectrum. There are no sharp boundaries in nature where one shade ends and another begins. There are only subtle, accumulating transitions. The genetic reality is that humans from opposite sides of the planet share approximately 99.9% of their DNA. The genes responsible for skin color occupy only a microscopic portion of our overall genome. Nature painted humanity on a unified canvas, prioritizing boundless connection over the categories we would later invent. If nature refused to draw rigid lines between us, why is our history defined by strict categories and boundaries? Early societies often used skin color as a simple economic marker rather than a racial one. In many cultures, a deep tan indicated you were a laborer working under the sun. Pale skin suggested you were wealthy enough to stay indoors. This labor-based distinction appeared in multiple empires, from Egyptian farmers to Roman aristocrats. In these societies, skin tone didn't denote ancestry, it signaled your occupation and social class. The modern concept of race was a later invention. Beginning in the 15th century, as European colonial empires expanded, scholars and explorers began classifying populations into rigid categories. These labels were used to provide a legal and moral justification for global exploitation and conquest. Institutions hijacked a harmless biological adaptation and transformed it into an artificial architecture of power. Sorting humans into boxes extended far beyond skin color. Empires have repeatedly engineered ways to force diverse populations into rigid operational roles. Consider the recruits of the Ottoman imperial harem. These were girls pulled from vastly different genetic and geographic backgrounds, from the mountain villages of the Balkans to the valleys of the Caucasus. Their pasts were systematically erased. Through years of education in Turkish, etiquette, and court protocol, they were molded to fit the exact specifications of the imperial household. This institution functioned as a machine designed to delete natural diversity and format human lives into a strict social hierarchy. While the Ottomans formatted individuals, the Mongol Empire under Kublai Khan specialized in mass human categorization. Kublai Khan inherited the largest land empire in history, a tapestry of Eurasian cultures too vast to be managed from the back of a horse. To rule millions, he needed a system to sort them. He constructed a massive, rigid bureaucracy. Through strict court protocols and ceremonial rankings, he forced the fluid reality of global human geography into a highly organized imperial filing cabinet. It was an administrative effort to replace the chaos of the open step with the order of the ledger. This demand for strict categorization extended beyond government halls and into the psychological development of children. In medieval Japan, a samurai child was not permitted to grow organically. From an early age, they were systematically trained to suppress natural human instincts like fear, physical comfort, and playfulness. They were subjected to intense martial and psychological conditioning, all designed to ensure they could fulfill their social obligations to a feudal lord without hesitation. The samurai was a human being molded perfectly to fit the rigid, uncompromising box of a warrior class. We are defined by two competing forces. Nature specializes in fluid gradients and endless mixing to help us survive. Human institutions build walls and categories to maintain power. Our own DNA reveals a quiet history of continuous movement, migration, and biological intermingling across many thousands of years.
This stands in stark contrast to our historical records, which are overwhelmingly obsessed with drawing borders, classifying races, and enforcing social ranks. The physical traits that seem to divide us, and the social hierarchies we are pushed into, are temporary artifacts of our environments and the ambitions of our ancestors. The boxes we built to separate ourselves are temporary social inventions. Our shared history remains written in the biological gradients of nature, connecting every branch of the human family. We like to imagine that human civilization is built entirely on grand, calculated plans. We picture history as a series of flawless equations, solved by dignified leaders and executed with absolute precision. But absolute perfection is actually highly fragile. It is incredibly easy to forget, blending into the background until it disappears from memory entirely. The stories that endure for centuries almost always stem from monumental mistakes, broken rules, and deeply eccentric behavior. To understand how history's greatest legacies are actually forged, we have to put away the pristine blueprints. We need to look at a sinking bell tower, a squad of armed women, an exhausted prime minister, and an emperor losing his mind. In the 12th century, the wealthy citizens of Pisa ordered the construction of a massive white marble bell tower. They chose to balance this thousands-of-ton monument on a dangerously shallow foundation of soft clay, sand, and waterlogged soil. Before the third floor was even finished, the ground sank and the tower tilted. Luckily for the builders, Pisa immediately got distracted by decades of warfare with neighboring cities. During that long pause, the weight of the lower floors slowly compressed the soft earth, stabilizing the foundation just enough to prevent a collapse. Modern engineers discovered that this soft clay acts as a geological cushion. During an earthquake, the mushy soil absorbs the destructive energy, shielding the rigid stone tower from the impact. In the 1930s, fascist dictator Benito Mussolini decided this leaning monument was an embarrassment. He ordered engineers to force the tower straight by pumping cement into the foundation. The extra weight simply caused the base to sink even deeper, making the lean worse than ever. Mussolini hated the tilt, but the public fell in love with it. Today, millions of visitors travel to Italy specifically to interact with its broken perspective, standing on the lawn to strike the exact same ridiculous pose. A perfectly straight tower would have faded into the background of European architecture. Instead, its geological vulnerability is what guaranteed both its physical survival and its fame. Ancient Rome demanded strict order from its citizens. Elite women were expected to embody quiet dignity and modesty, remaining effectively invisible in public life. Yet beneath that polished exterior, the empire possessed an insatiable addiction to the bloody chaos of the amphitheater. This contradiction created the environment for the gladiatrices. These were armed female fighters who subverted Roman laws and aristocratic expectations, stepping onto the sand to fight for fame, money, and survival. We know they existed from artifacts like this stone relief of Amazon and Aquileia. Notice their heads. Female gladiators often fought entirely bareheaded. They wanted the roaring crowds to recognize their gender immediately. These women achieved fame by becoming a spectacular, transgressive glitch in the Roman system. During the darkest days of the Second World War, as bombs shattered the streets of London, you might assume that saving the free world required absolute discipline and rigid military schedules. Instead, Britain's war effort was directed by a prime minister who frequently dictated memos from his bed in silk pajamas and paced the halls in unconventional velvet siren suits. This is the briefing room where Churchill shifted the real work to the middle of the night. He hosted strategy dinners that dragged on until 3 a.m, fueling his inner circle with heavy roasted meats, steady streams of champagne, and a suffocating cloud of cigar smoke. This late-night scheduling served a tactical purpose. Churchill used exhaustion to strip away polite bureaucratic manners, forcing his commanders into honest, aggressive debates over crucial invasion plans. He used his own eccentric chaos to project a sense of unstoppable momentum. When Britain was at its most vulnerable, its leader simply refused to acknowledge standard limitations, including the human need for sleep. But there is a point where rule-breaking tips past eccentricity and into absolute, uncontrolled madness. That brings us to the Roman Emperor Caligula. Caligula treated the empire like a personal theater. He commanded the construction of massive floating pleasure palaces and routinely humiliated the Senate, forcing aristocratic politicians to act as background extras in his daily dramas. He eventually demanded divine honors, showing up to official government meetings dressed as mythological deities to see if anyone in the room was brave enough to question his divinity. This unpredictable theater carried a fatal consequence. Pushed past their breaking point, his own exhausted Praetorian guards eventually cornered and assassinated him in a palace hallway. His madness destroyed his life and destabilized his empire. Yet it secured exactly what he wanted, a legacy that outlived thousands of perfectly competent politicians. Whether it's an engineering disaster in Italy, a social rebellion in Rome, a strategic disruption in a war room, or a break from reality, these anomalies share a common thread. Human civilization operates like a messy relay race of repairs. We are wired to recognize the struggle of a structure that refuses to fall, finding raw resilience more compelling than sterile perfection. Doing things perfectly might earn you temporary admiration, but if you want history to remember your name, it helps to be a little flawed.
We usually define empires by what we can see: steel blades, high stone walls, and vast geographical borders. But physical force is a limited resource. When a civilization relies strictly on the sword, the structure eventually begins to disintegrate. The logistical cost of pure coercion is simply too high. To make a population do the impossible, to build cities on water or surrender their children to a distant ruler, you cannot rely on guards alone. History is driven by a constant struggle between two opposing forces. On one side is the state, attempting to engineer obedience through mandated doctrine. On the other is the individual, using their own organic conviction to navigate or even dismantle the system. The pursuit of absolute authority requires the state to dictate reality itself, transforming the private convictions of its people into an instrument of governance. Tenochtitlan was a metropolis that seemed to defy the laws of geography. Built in the center of Lake Texcoco, it was an organized aquatic capital that rivaled any city in 16th century Europe in scale and complexity. Feeding this massive population required the construction of chinampas, man-made islands of mud and reeds stabilized by deep-rooted trees. This system was incredibly productive, but it demanded continuous, grueling maintenance from thousands of laborers just to keep the city from starving. The Aztec state justified this intense physical burden by merging it with religion. They taught that the universe was fragile, and that without constant work and ritual sacrifice, the sun would stop moving. In this system, labor was not a tax, it was a requirement for cosmic survival. For the average citizen, the ruler's decrees were indistinguishable from the will of the gods. The hierarchy was a mirror of the universe, placing every individual in a mandatory role. Tenochtitlan was the ultimate success of top-down engineering. It was a civilization where the state and the belief system occupied the exact same space. As the Ottoman Empire expanded across 3 continents, it faced a different problem. To manage such a vast territory, the Sultan needed a professional class of administrators and soldiers whose loyalty was not tied to their families or their homelands, but solely to the throne. The empire's solution was the devshirme system. Imperial officers traveled into isolated communities in the Balkans and selected the most promising young boys to be taken into state service. This was a systematic attempt to erase an individual's past. By removing these children from their families and their language, the state effectively cleared their mental slate, preparing them to be rebuilt with a new identity tailored to the needs of the empire. These recruits were converted to Islam and put through rigorous training within the palace walls.
They were taught to see themselves not as displaced children, but as elite servants whose absolute loyalty to the Sultan was the only foundation of their power. The Def Shirma showed that an empire could successfully sustain itself by treating human conviction as a form of modular software, stripping away local heritage and installing a state-approved identity in its place. But belief often grows from the ground up, independent of any central authority. In ancient Hispania, tribes gathered in deep, untamed forests. These sacred groves were not managed by a government. They were organic spaces where the community connected with nature and their ancestors. These tribes didn't need a state decree to maintain their faith. They willingly surrendered their most precious jewelry and weapons to sacred springs and rivers, using shared ritual to bind their communities together against the harsh realities of the natural world. This kind of decentralized conviction is the ultimate threat to state control. By the 15th century, the French kingdom was paralyzed by English military dominance. The state's top-down structures completely failed. Then, Joan of Arc appeared. She was an illiterate teenager who claimed to receive direct orders from heaven. She ignored the failing military hierarchy and spoke with a level of certainty that bypassed every established rule of medieval society. Her conviction was contagious. She led exhausted soldiers into attacks that experienced commanders had deemed impossible. By convincing an entire army that God was on their side, she effectively hijacked the war and reversed the momentum of a collapsing kingdom. Joan demonstrated that raw, individual conviction can outperform a top-down imperial machine, provided it is fueled by a certainty the state cannot manufacture. The English and the Church executed Joan because she was a variable they couldn't regulate. They didn't just kill a soldier. They tried to delete a source of belief that existed outside their own legal and theological control. But the state is pragmatic. Once Joan was gone and France had regained its strength, the same institutions that condemned her co-opted her memory. They eventually transformed the executed heretic into a canonized saint, repurposing her individual conviction to serve the new national narrative. Tenochtitlan's massive temples and floating gardens eventually succumbed to the tangible pressures of disease and siege, leaving behind only these excavated foundations. Yet the memory of Joan's individual conviction proved much more resilient, ultimately outlasting the physical structures of the state that tried to erase her. Even the Ottomans' psychological engineering eventually backfired. The Janissaries, once the Sultan's most loyal tools, realized their own collective power. Over time, they became a political faction so influential they could depose the very rulers they were programmed to protect. Belief remains an unpredictable tool of governance. It can mobilize millions to build cities or sustain global empires. But because it is housed within the mind, it can never be perfectly standardized. As history consistently proves, the same conviction that builds a throne often holds the power to dismantle it. History is full of practices that seem to defy reason. We see neighbors plunging bare arms into boiling water to settle disputes, the most powerful men in Europe parading in bright red stilettos, and a conqueror handing his empire to his daughters. Our modern assumption is that these ancestors were simply flawed, driven by blind superstition, regressive traditions, or pure vanity. We assume they lacked the logic we use today. But human beings are survival machines. If a bizarre custom lasted for centuries, it didn't survive because of stupidity. It functioned as a highly effective tool. These specific practices served as calculated systems of power, hidden in plain sight. Medieval authorities faced an absolute administrative nightmare. They had to maintain order with no forensic science, no DNA, and a society driven entirely by gossip. Their solution was the trial by ordeal. To determine the truth, the accused might carry a piece of glowing iron, be lowered into a freezing river, or swallow cursed cheese. The real lie detector wasn't a miracle. It was the weaponization of the population's deep religious terror. This decision matrix reveals the trap.
Innocents confidently agree to the test. The guilty, fearing divine punishment, confess before touching the fire. For those who endured the ordeal, verdicts remained in human hands. Judges declared wounds infected or clean based purely on village consensus. If the ordeal failed, courts turned to compurgation, where an accused person cleared their name by gathering enough neighbors to swear to their innocence. Medieval justice prioritized village stability, using psychological warfare and popularity contests to keep the peace. In 17th century France, King Louis XIV took a different approach to control. He filled the Palace of Versailles with noblemen wearing towering wigs, silk stockings, and bright red high heels. King Louis XIV faced a dangerous problem. For generations, the French nobility had functioned as warlords, plotting rebellions and starting civil wars. Instead of fighting them on the battlefield, he trapped them in a hyper-competitive fashion culture centered at his palace. The red heels were a physical immobilizer. They made it nearly impossible to perform useful labor, mount a horse quickly, or engage in combat. On the polished marble floors of Versailles, the nobles were effectively stuck. But this was also a financial trap. Louis made mandatory court fashions change so rapidly that the nobility bankrupted themselves to stay relevant, making them entirely dependent on the king's financial favor. He restricted specific red heels to his inner circle, turning a piece of dyed leather into a highly regulated membership badge for political access. Louis weaponized vanity to solve a military problem. In a single generation, he reduced dangerous warlords to bankrupt lapdogs competing for his attention. On the Mongol steppe, survival was even more direct. In a world of brutal winters and constant tribal raids, the luxury of Versailles was impossible. To build his empire, Genghis Khan appeared to follow a standard medieval tradition, marrying his daughters off to the rulers of allied tribes. But he manipulated the practice. After the wedding, Genghis would send his new sons-in-law to the vanguard of his armies, where they were likely to die in battle, leaving his daughters as the sole rulers of those territories. This strategy relied on the fact that Mongol girls were raised for the saddle. Their upbringing in the harsh environment of the steppe made them competent riders, survivors, and strategists. These women governed the frontier trade routes marked here, managing the wealth of the Silk Road and the complex military logistics required to sustain the empire's growth. Where weakness meant death, the Mongols didn't care about traditional gender roles. They ensured imperial stability through ruthless competence. Whether leveraging the fear of infection, weaponizing red dye, or deploying fierce daughters to hostile borders, human beings have always been master engineers of social control. While our ancestors lacked modern data, their grasp of human psychology and leverage was absolute. This forces us to ask, what rituals do we participate in today that we accept as completely normal? We navigate corporate jargon, curate our digital lives on social media, and participate in the theatrics of modern politics. We treat these as the natural order, yet they serve as the mechanisms we use to enforce hierarchy. Future historians will undoubtedly laugh at our modern customs, until they realize they were just the weird, highly calculated ways we survived and structured our own power. We tend to view history through a cinematic lens, a world of pristine white marble, soaring architecture, and quiet dignity bathed in a permanent Mediterranean sun. Step inside one of these homes, however, and the illusion vanishes. You would encounter a world of thick indoor smoke, the heavy scent of unwashed wounds, and people navigating their lives with the sound of cracking knees and chronic rattling coughs. To understand these civilizations, we have to look past the monuments. The true story of our most transformative eras is found in the physical and psychological endurance of the people who actually built them. Athens is often remembered for its philosophy, but for the average citizen, the city was mostly just rocks. The terrain surrounding these temples was a landscape of sharp, slippery, uneven ground that attacked human ankles with every step. Most Greeks navigated this terrain in thin leather sandals that offered almost no support.
For the working class, this meant walking through life with a permanent collection of cuts, splinters, and chronic foot deformities that were simply accepted as a part of being an adult. Even the daily bread was a hazard. Because flour was ground between heavy stone mills, tiny fragments of rock regularly mixed into the dough. This meant that for 40 years, every meal effectively sanded down the person's molars until the nerves were exposed. When the pain became unbearable, a local would simply grab the tooth with metal tools and pull until it came free. With no anesthesia or antibiotics, dental care was an endurance contest that occasionally left the patient in shock. Rather than treating this as a medical crisis, Greek society, and the Spartans in particular, recast this constant agony as a virtue. They conditioned their citizens to believe that enduring pain quietly was a mandatory civic duty, transforming a lack of medicine into a test of character. In a medieval town, the local barber shop served as the primary medical hub. It was a place where a man could get a quick shave in the morning and a life-saving, agonizing surgery in the afternoon, often in the same wooden chair. University-trained physicians of the era often viewed physical labor as beneath them, preferring to study ancient texts rather than touch an open wound. This left uneducated tradesmen, the barbers, to handle the era's most gruesome injuries using the same blades they used for hair. If a tooth became infected, the barber used heavy iron forceps to wrench it from the jaw. The necklace of teeth often displayed in these shops wasn't just a decoration, it was a resume, proving the barber had the physical strength to perform the extraction. For almost any other ailment, the go-to treatment was bloodletting. Based on a misunderstanding of internal biology, barbers would drain significant amounts of blood into a bowl, believing that reducing the body's fluids would restore a healthy balance. These procedures were unsterilized, performed without pain relief, and often left the patient weaker than when they arrived. Yet medieval people submitted to them because, in a world before antibiotics, the barber's chair was the only chance they had at surviving a deepening infection. We picture the Renaissance as a quiet time of serene masterpieces, but an artist's workshop was a loud, industrial environment. It was a place of constant physical labor, where the creation of beauty required a heavy toll on the body. Apprentices spent years at the bottom of the hierarchy, performing the grueling task of manually crushing minerals and stones into fine dust to create pigments. They spent their days inhaling toxic particles just so the master could have the right shade of blue or red. Leonardo da Vinci's obsession with experimental methods often backfired. He ignored the proven traditional techniques for the Last Supper, causing the painting to begin flaking off the wall shortly after he finished it. To achieve his famous realism, Leonardo required a level of anatomical detail that could only be found in the morgue. He led his apprentices into hospitals at night to assist in the illegal, foul-smelling dissection of human corpses. He filled his notebooks with these findings, recording the mechanics of muscles and organs in his signature mirrored handwriting, partly to protect his morbid data from prying eyes. This intellectual leap forward wasn't just a moment of inspiration. It was built on the back of toxic exposure, grueling manual labor, and a regular, gruesome proximity to death. In Tudor England, the personal desires of King Henry VIII could alter the course of an entire nation. He was a charismatic ruler whose search for stability and a male heir created a climate of constant fear. For 20 years, Catherine of Aragon served as a loyal queen, but her repeated failures to produce a surviving son became a political crisis. As pregnancies ended in tragedy, Henry began to view his marriage as a spiritual obstacle to his dynasty's future. When Anne Boleyn entered the court, she refused to be another mistress. To marry her, Henry dismantled England's relationship with Rome, triggering a religious shift that would upend the lives of every citizen in the kingdom. But power was volatile. When Anne also failed to provide a son, she was quickly transformed into a condemned prisoner. She was executed at the Tower of London, less than 3 years after her coronation. The child born from that bloody transition, the daughter Henry initially viewed as a failure, the intricate stone vaults of Westminster Abbey represent more than architectural genius.
They are a manifestation of decades of manual labor, carved and hoisted by workers who likely never knew a day without physical pain. When we look at history, we shouldn't just see the achievements. We should see the people who pushed through their own suffering to build a world they would never live to see.